All right, so welcome back to I'm Stupid About. Today we're going to be talking about policing and different subjects in that regard. Um, which one was our first subject?
So I think that the thing that a lot of people are talking about these days and is the main focus that has to do with policing is protests. So there's been kind of ongoing protests throughout the country and
Right.
they continue in places like Portland. So I guess kind of from your perspective as a past police officer and kind of knowing what it's like, I guess I wanted to start off with saying that I'm stupid about policing in regards to the protests and a lot of the things that come with the protests and how it feels as on the other side of that, what you think about it. So
Right, so I mean, obviously there's a lot to talk about when it comes to protests. And I'm not going to even cover the fact that it is a right. It's one of your amendments, it's the First Amendment, so that's something anybody, if they want to go look that up, you have every, ability to do so. So I won't get into that regard. But I think from a law enforcement standpoint, when I started thinking about being on the other side of that protest, I think back to, I believe it was, I don't think it was Michael Brown, it was Castile, and I think someone else was killed by the police. And I think both of those shootings ended up being either justified and you can look that up. But basically, we had a protest at Lennox Station, which is at MARTA, Atlanta, so for the people that don't know. And being on the other side of it, you can just feel the anger, you can feel the frustration, with the entire system from people because, they've seen a history of things where some police officers in some shootings have gotten off and
Right.
they have kind of skated or for shootings that may be, even though they may be legally justified, there was other options that could have been pursued, and I think that's what people are really upset about because, it's not enough just to legally justify the shooting for them. They think that it should be a last recourse, and it's a very touchy subject because a lot of people don't understand that you can easily say that when you're not in the situation.
sure.
Because just like that person, that's like the families, the officer and of course their loved one want them to come home as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very hard to speak about why people are protesting because the situations are so different. They're not all the same.
Right.
Every situation is different. They have their own circumstances surrounding them. So it's very hard to speak about that. But what I will touch on is the protests themselves. I can only imagine what those officers are going through because
Right.
how exhausting it is. Some of these officers are probably pulling in 12, 16-hour shifts
Right.
every day. I mean,
And doing so in a situation where some people are being very aggressive and yelling at them for basically hours on end,
Right.
and having to maintain calm and keep peace at that point, right? So
right. And you just got to wonder about the mental health of these officers because, I mean, you imagine someone just yelling and screaming and obviously not all of them are peaceful, so sometimes you got even objects thrown at them.
right.
You can just imagine what that feels like inside. You have to go out, and that is your job.
Mhm.
Normally when you're policing, you just answer 911 calls, which it could vary, between armed robberies or domestic disputes or thefts or vandalism, et cetera, et cetera. But now they're having to go their whole day just standing in formation, standing a line.
Right. And doing their job when people are basically saying what you're doing or you're bad people essentially at times,
Right.
or saying that what you do is wrong and we don't want you here either. So not only are you doing a very stressful job, but you're doing it to protect the same people that are basically saying we don't like what you're doing either at the
Right.
same time. And I guess my question for you in terms of like your experience with protests and things like that, or even having any kind of experience with that, like, do you feel like that the majority of the feeling at those times as a police officer is that you're getting anger directed at you? Like, is there anything that you feel like is helping to get a conversation started, or are these protests mostly very emotional at that point? Or do you feel like that there's at those moments as police officers that you're basically just getting the emotional response of the people at that time?
Well, it's really complicated because on one hand, I understand the purpose of protests is because they want change. They want things to. We have to bring awareness to a situation, and a lot of times through traditional avenues, politicians
Right.
or the media, if they cover it or not, there's not enough awareness to what's going on a daily basis or what's going on, and given that happens, people believe that protest is the only way they can garner the attention that they
Sure.
need. So I definitely understand why it's taking place. But at the same time, on the other side, of that, it's like, you know, I think the mistreatment and the throwing of objects and the rioting and things like that,
Right.
that is what I don't understand.
Right.
Because that only damages your community, which is terrible when you start thinking about funding. Because, most local governments and state governments are already during this pandemic
Right.
overburdened. So there's no additional money to also rebuild these cities and help these businesses out. So when they damage those and when they just basically cause all kind of destruction, that's not getting anything across.
Right.
And then you're only pushing the people that are kind of on the fence.
Mhm.
You're going to push them away because they're not going to, be inclined to, listen to your message regardless of how justified or how right it is. They're not going to probably listen. So now you got more division that way, and that's why it's one of those things where I'm kind of straddling the fence. But what I will say about it is the true purpose of these protests, in my regard, is to change the system and the laws in place.
Right.
Because the laws and the training, and we'll get to training later on, but the laws and the methods and the procedures, those are the things that have to be protested against. The people in the uniform is not the people that has to be protested against, because they're just like you. They go home to their families, they pay their bills, they pay their taxes, they don't make a bunch of money. I know some people believe that, they got all these part-time stuff like that. Trust me, they're either working a ton of hours to get that money, and it's not really what you want any police officer to be doing in terms of a majority of the time, because it's exhausting. It's so exhausting to be in your uniform and act in an authoritarian role for 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and I've known officers that done that. So it's probably best if people understand what the purpose is, and I think that's what gets lost sometimes when we start getting to the rioting.
Well, I think sometimes, I think that it sounds like what you're saying, and what I think I would agree with, is that the peaceful protest of bringing attention is what is going to bring about change, and that when we get to the more talking about looting or rioting and actually causing destruction, that's when things kind of fall off the rails in terms of the message. But I think sometimes that these protests, it feels like there's almost a two-pronged approach, right? Like sometimes the protests are talking also about bringing change systemically to how policing is done.
Right.
And then additionally, I think sometimes protests are being done, and rightly so, to bring attention to the injustice of maybe a specific case. So for obviously the example of George Floyd in Minneapolis is a perfect example that I think those protests led to making sure that an action was actually taken, and so that we don't continue to have.
Absolutely.
So it's almost like I think protests are both systemic and sometimes very specific to a case. And so I think sometimes we have to look at like these protests, so they're bringing attention for maybe two different reasons at the same time, right? Like maybe to initially begin getting justice for injustice,
right,
in a specific case, and then maybe on a larger scale as well, right?
Yeah, and I tend to agree with that. Like I said, I don't. Anybody that says, "Oh, they shouldn't be doing that," I disagree with them completely, because there are definitely things that have to change, not just in policing, but in society as a whole, and how we look on how we treat people. So there's a reason for this.
Right.
I just think that people have to be, a little bit more, I don't want to say understanding, but open, because police have to do their job.
Right.
And there's sometimes where force is the only option, and it could have terrible outcomes for both sides, because, anytime, obviously for the families that lose loved ones, they're going to be the ones dealing with the most grief and pain.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that officer's not going to be going through their own things themselves. I mean, if they happen to be on the other end, the one that have to take a life, that could have a very significant impact on their mental health. Right. So I think people need to be open to all facets of this and understand that while we want to reach the best solution to keep people safe ultimately, and hopefully everybody can go home or go to their respective places, we can't be foolish or blind to the fact that that's not going to happen in every case. You know, there's going to be situations where someone may not go home.
Right.
And that's what police officers understand every day they go and do their job.
Right.
There might be a day that come a time where you have to give the ultimate sacrifice and lay down your life. I'm pretty sure, and I don't know the statistics on this, you know, maybe we'll look it up later on to confirm, but I'm pretty sure it's probably already over 100 officers that probably lost their life this year in the line of duty. And some of them, due to those protests, some of the vicious attacks that's happened in some of these rioting and looting and ambushes that's occurred because of these protests. So I think, like I said, people need to be open and understand that these are just human beings just like anybody else. And the people that's calling for violence, those are the people that we need to really, really, really be putting our focus on, because that's only going to create more divisions on both sides.
Right.
You know,
makes more of a line between the two of when you're talking about it, us versus them, and it's really us all together, right? That's the goal. So kind of going off at that point, what do you think about some of the situations like in Portland where the police have said, we're just going to allow this area to be almost a police-free zone and just allow protesting to occur as long as it's peaceful, obviously, and to basically just remove police from the area and allow that to be a protest without police? Do you think that helps bring the tensions down in some of those cases so we don't have the violence? And do you think it's a good idea, or what do you think is the best way?
Well, I mean, I've seen arguments on both sides. I think recently the district attorney, I'm not sure if it's a state or is it just for that Portland, but I think recently they basically said they're not going to prosecute anyone for nonviolent acts. So when we come out with bold statements and quite frankly, I'm just going to call it ludicrous, because when you start telling people that they're not going to get prosecuted for something, then it's going to make people more inclined to do things and to push the boundaries. I mean, it's as simple as it goes. The more rope you give someone, the more they're going to take. Sure. So it's kind of hard to enforce the law when, you know, it's against the law, but we know you're going to be right back on the streets the next day. So it's like, why am I even wasting my time? And you really don't want to do that, because you're just wasting resources at that point.
But do you think it helps the situation so that, do you think that allows for more peaceful protests to happen and also removes the problems that like your police officers might be in the line of more aggressive situations? Like, or do you feel like because once you remove that policing that it will inevitably turn into violence and destruction?
It's really tricky, because, you know, it's kind of like the opinion of some is that, oh, when you send militarized police units and, you know, National Guard or whoever, that people, they come out more, that they're upset about that, because now you've responded in such a way that's it enables, or it basically emboldens people to come out. But the problem with that is, if we do not respond, if we do not try to keep the peace, and next thing you know, the businesses are getting looted, they're getting rioted. I mean, I think I looked on the news the other day in Chicago, where there's business owners that's been hit twice now. And they're getting ready to sue the city. Because they're just like, well, you guys got to do something, because I can't sustain, there's no way I'm going to be able to stay in business if, you know, all my merchandise is stolen and my stores are destroyed. So it's one of those things where, you want to pull back and let people have the space to peacefully protest. But if you pull so far back and then that turns the other way, now you got a bigger problem, because, like I said, that's when the destruction comes in. Think about what happened when, I'm sorry, it's escaping me right now. What was that when George Floyd?
Minneapolis.
Yeah, think about what happened in Minneapolis when they pulled back. I mean, it was all right. I mean, they was setting fires to so many different buildings and just destruction on cars, and it's just so much happened that I can't even come here and try to think about all the damage that happened. So, and that's what happened when you pull those forces back and you don't go in and try to quell and stop. I think they lost the precinct. You know, that is very and it's funny, because before that, I don't think that's ever happened before, to my knowledge. And then it happened again in Seattle, and I think it might have happened again in Portland, maybe. So it's like, you see what happens when you just take a hands-off approach.
Right.
It's going to be all downright anarchy.
Right.
And so you got to find a healthy balance between the two.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I feel about that. You know, just got to have a healthy balance between allowing people the ability to peacefully protest,
Mm-hmm.
but you're still going to have to, I guess, lack of a better word, monitor the protest. You're just going to have to do it, because if you pull all the way back and you're not prepared, then businesses are going to suffer.
Right.
And communities, that's what ultimately suffers, the same community that protests.
Right.